Partnerships aren't going away. The most successful companies out there are the ones who are putting in the time and the effort to build partnerships. They can help either enter new markets, access new technologies, reinforce relationships with your own customers, increase sales, increase revenue. Benefits definitely outweigh the efforts that you put in.
Welcome to this episode of the Industrial Growth Insitute Podcast. I'm Ed Marsh, your host. Across different episodes, I chat with some folks who are experts in theory, and in other cases, the conversations are more focused on practical execution. I had a great conversation with Franz Schrepp about the theory of partnerships, and today I'm joined by Samantha Gadenne, who brings deep insight into the actual implementation. Samantha is Director of Portfolio Development at EIT Food and has over 20 years of experience in helping young companies bring emerging technologies to market. She specialized in using the network effect to build partnerships with major corporations. Previous successes that she's had include helping an ag tech scale up, expand over 40 new markets, and leading a food tech scale up to 5x their annual recurring revenue, even in the midst of COVID. In her current role, she works to build coalitions which leverage private and public funding to help find solutions for some of the biggest challenges facing the agri-food industry today. I originally met Samantha during COVID and have gotten to see her in action building partnerships during COVID and afterwards for over 3 years now. I've known that I needed to get her on the podcast, and I'm so excited that we could finally work it out and she could join me today. So please like and share the podcast on whatever platform you prefer that you like to listen or watch on. Drop a comment to offer your opinion on Samantha's insights and maybe engage her in some conversation. And please subscribe. So after a few months of trying to get schedules aligned, welcome, Samantha. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Ed. Happy to be here. And yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing any comments or questions that come up from people who are listening afterwards.
Good. So we need to start with congratulations. I think you just got a promotion.
Yeah, indeed. I just moved to this new Director of Portfolio Development role about a month and a half ago. So it's been wonderful.
Nice. Now, you're a native of Twin Cities, right?
Yeah, I'm from Minnesota originally, but now based over in France, actually. So jump the other side of the pond.
So you went to school in the U.S. for college, then you went to school in Finland for language, you went to France for your MBA. You've lived and worked in the U.S., I think the U.K., and now France, and France on and off for 15 years. What drove all the international interest for you?
The international side, I think, was really born from my grandparents on my maternal side who immigrated to the U.S. from Finland. So we've always had kind of this connection with Europe and did a lot of trips over here when I was a kid. And it really sparked my interest, I guess, or my passion for international environments. And that led me then when I was at the University of Minnesota to become involved in different exchange student programs. And from there, I met a Frenchman and ended up following him back to France once my studies were done. So that's kind of how my French adventure began.
So I'm familiar with the Swedish and German communities in the Twin Cities. I didn't realize there was a Finnish community.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of a funny joke with my family because we would tease my grandparents and say, you could have gone anywhere in the U.S., right? You could have gone to California, you could have gone to Florida, anywhere with warm. And I guess you stick with what you know. They chose Minnesota with lakes, trees, and farmland. So,
right.
Yeah, that's where we ended up.
So speaking of what you know, you majored in nutrition in school, and your work since then has all been in one way or another food related, from when you were doing R&D at Land O'Lakes and General Mills through food manufacturing automation to even blockchain and really ethereal digital products and services, but all focused on food. So tell us about that food journey.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I've been doing a lot of mentoring for young students now, and one of the messages that I always try and share with them is to just be open to opportunities. I think especially in the US, people talk about what's your 5-year plan? What's your 10-year plan? What do you want to be doing 15 years from now? And pretty much every role that I've had didn't exist in the past. And so there's no way I could have dreamt it up, or there's no way that I could have thought about, what role I wanted to have 5 years from now. And so for me, it's just more about being open and having conversations. And when I think about my career, the most roles that I've had, they weren't actually even posted roles. they were roles that were kind of born out of conversations with people. So my biggest advice to anyone is just be curious. And same for partnerships. It goes both for careers and for partnerships, is just be curious, ask questions. And that's how you start having conversations where you can see that there's a gap that maybe you can fill, or maybe you know someone who could fill, and then it kind of becomes this full circle, and you really start building a relationship with the owner of that problem. And that's really kind of how my career has grown over time as well, is just talking with people and seeing, okay, you have this problem. Oh, actually, maybe I can help out with that, or maybe I know someone who can help out with that. And it's led to roles, like you said, working within industry, working in startups, and then now working with EIT Food, which is a nonprofit focused on innovation for the agri-food system. So
yeah, tell us a little bit more about what EIT Food does.
Yeah, it's a great organization. We were founded in 2018 by the European Commission. So they had this goal of wanting to create the world's largest agri-food network. So we bring together corporates from farm to fork. We bring together all the big research centers and universities in Europe. We bring together all kinds of startups and innovators, and really try to bring everyone together to collaborate and try to drive positive change, positive impact for our food system. So it could be agricultural technologies, looking at reducing pesticide usage, looking at building robots that can help with harvesting on farms, because labor shortages are becoming a bigger challenge. It could be new types of proteins, new technologies. So it's really, really broad and really interesting, because we're exposed to so many innovations every day.
So the very essence of the organization then is partnerships. It's all one big partnership that's formed from an aggregation of other partnerships, it sounds like.
Yeah, for sure. Partnerships play a huge role in what we do, and it's really interesting. I think we might get into it a bit later, but this is a different side of partnerships than I've seen in the past, because this is kind of the mix of public-private partnerships then, and how finding win-wins for both sides is a really different value proposition than what I've been working with in the past. So even for me, it's been good for my own partnership growth skills.
All right. So an important part of your background for the audience, just to give us some context, the audience tends to be middle market industrial manufacturing companies. And so even though you're doing PPPs now, and you're doing agri-food, and you did blockchain and stuff like that, but at your during your time at Novatech, which is a company that does a lot of manufacturing technology and automation for agriculture, you worked with middle market industrial manufacturing. I think you were there 12 years. And so you've got insights into the mindset of companies that build machines and do automation, as well as the mindset of companies that are doing software, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it was really interesting, because we didn't initially start out at Novatech with wanting to build partnerships. It just really grew organically. I would say at the time when I started out, they were a very US focused company. They were starting to look at exploring entering into the EU market. They had some initial requests, but no employees here. So I was their first employee based in Europe. And the partnership aspect evolved just out of limited bandwidth, basic necessity. I was the only employee who was here. And so while visiting my customers, I started talking with other solution providers who were maybe on site, who had different equipment that could be linked potentially to our manufacturing capabilities, and who were part of really global organizations. And so once I realized that these companies were working around the world in entities or sites where we also wanted to be, we just started having conversations. And the more and more I talked to them, the more and more they were willingly opening up doors for us, offering leads, to help us get into the spaces where we really wanted to get in and grow. And that's how we basically ended up developing in 40 new markets, was through these initial conversations that were breached over a cup of coffee in a factory setting, basically. So that's the start of it.
I think the interesting point about that is it's all kind of spawned organically. Nobody sat down and issued an edict from headquarters saying we're going to start doing partnerships. You just kind of had an interest internationally, you had an interest in people, you had an interest in connecting and conversing and asking questions, and that's how it started.
Yeah, for me, so much is just curiosity, asking questions, having a conversation, and that's where opportunities are born. And I think initially we looked at a lot of more informal partnerships, so where we didn't have anything formal on paper. It was just, hey, I know you're going to this country, I'm going to this country. You might want to meet with this person, and opening doors on both sides. So it was working on a two-way street. And so we were sharing both leads and making recommendations to customers. And with the third company over time, it really developed into something a lot more formal, I would say, where we were looking at potentially co-developing equipment together that could be beneficial for both parties, involving training of their employees, of our employees, and really looking at how can we have this joint value proposition that would then benefit both us, each company, and then also our customers as well. So.
And we'll talk more about it later, but I'm wondering, that evolution, was it a product of your ongoing curiosity and asking deeper questions, or at some point did it get traction and management say, wait a minute, this is an interesting opportunity that Samantha's opened up for us. Let's talk about how we can formalize this some.
That's a good question, because I would say initially management was a bit reticent to go that route. There's often a lot of questions about, especially with technologies, equipment, IP, who's going to own the IP, how do you split revenue sharing, all of these questions. So initially they were hesitant to explore that route. And for me, in my personal experience, I think the best route has been to start with one test case, start with one test site. So at the time, I was really looking to enter the Egyptian market. And this particular company was very well implanted in Egypt, but was also struggling with certain technical aspects of their machines. And so we had kind of identified this joint case together where perhaps we could help them get better results for their customers and also help us gain more market share within Egypt. And so it really led to this first test case. And then that really helped show management later on that there was value in perhaps replicating this in another market. And then it grew from there. And then they were able to buy in and say, okay, this makes sense for us to really sit down management to management together and start to put this on paper and formalize it.
Interesting. All right. So quick side note, as we record this a couple days ago, we saw in the news a big surge in Make America Healthy Again started trending as Robert Kennedy's impassioned statements on health and food in the U.S. got a lot of traction. You've got perspective from inside and outside the U.S., from Europe, which has a different, I think, approach to food. What do you recommend that Americans understand about our food supply chain, agriculture, and health based on your ability to see things from a couple different perspectives?
That's a really interesting question. I think, for one, COVID really showed us that there are a lot of challenges. Global supply chains do great things. They mean that we have access to the broad ranges of food that we have in our supermarkets today that we didn't have, when I was growing up, for example, in Minnesota. It tended to be a lot more local produce than today. Now you can buy anything from anywhere. But then anytime there's the smallest break in the supply chain, then also the challenges are multiplied in that sense. So what we see in Europe anyways is a lot of our partners and a lot of the companies that we work with are looking to relocalize in a sense and find more local sources of production, going back to maybe previous grains or wheats or fruits or vegetables that used to be produced locally and are now imported, to try to see how then they can secure their supply chains. Because if you're a really big company, if you're Heinz tomato sauce or tomato ketchup, you need to have access to tomatoes very regularly in order to ensure your production. So trying to see how they can maybe shorten their supply chains is one of the big trends, I think, that we see. And then also that plays into their carbon footprint as well, because of course, the more locally you can source produce or products, the lower your carbon footprint is. And that's also a really big topic in Europe right now when it comes to supply chains.
And any observations on ingredients or degree of processing in food or oils or anything like that?
Yeah, also a very timely topic. We're actually just launching, I think it's next week or the week after, we'll have a kind of a think tank or working group on the ultra processed foods, because we of course work with a lot of ingredients companies, a lot of CPG finished product companies that we might see in the supermarket, and they're of course noticing the trends of people being scared of processed foods. So we're trying to think about how can we look at, one, educating the general population as what actually is a processed food. What does it mean? What are the health impacts? Because sometimes we do, flour is a processed food. People don't necessarily think of it.
Sure.
And so really looking at how is EIT Food as kind of neutral third party, how can we position ourselves to help have those conversations and help consumers become more educated and make maybe choices that are more in line with their own personal values.
Got it.
But yeah, there's definitely a lot of focus on clean label, clean ingredients, upcycled foods as well. So definitely all big topics for our partners.
Makes sense. So you kind of stumbled into partnerships by accident, and then one day you woke up and realized what you were doing. At that point,
Yeah.
did you look for places to go learn about it, or did you continue to just experiment on your own?
We really just experimented. I don't know if we were necessarily calling it partnerships even at that time. It's kind of like we were also doing SaaS, software as a service, at that time before SaaS was a thing. So you sometimes you're doing things before you even understand that you're doing them. But I think that was a time after we had a few success cases under our belt, we started really sitting down, at least thinking, what do we want out of a partnership? What's our goal? What types of partners do we want to engage with to continue to, for us, it was mainly focused on market development. And I look back at my career in partnerships, I've usually been working in smaller organizations that are partnering with much bigger organizations. So for us, it was really looking at getting access to either distribution or to their sales force. When I was working for the American company, again, I was the only person in Europe. And if I could partner with someone who had hundreds of sales staff all across the globe, it really, really opened things up for us. So for me, that really was the first step, but we were never in the early days as intentional about it as we maybe are today.
So you mentioned indirect sales channel, and of course, that's a form of partnership with which many industrial companies are familiar, but they tend to have this very narrow kind of vision of what's possible. I mean, essentially, one company exchanges paper with another company, and it's up to that company that's bought the product to now figure out how they're going to sell it and warehouse it and install it and support it. And it's a very much kind of a handoff, linear sort of relationship as opposed to a parallel sort of a relationship. So if that's where you kind of entered into partnerships, how did preconceptions that environment gave you impact you as you started thinking about more creative ways to do it?
Yeah, and I think in the past, partnerships really were a lot more transactional, I would say, and very driven by revenue or money or what one could get out of it. And I think today you really see them starting to go into more of a deeper level. So not just focused on revenue or not just focused on end product. They're really looking at going more in depth and broader across organizations. So you also see more parts of an organization involved within partnership and not necessarily just sales to sales or account management. And looking at things like data sharing, how can you share data in real time? How can you share insights or knowledge that can really help support each side be stronger in their market? And that's something that wasn't necessarily as prevalent in the past, where money was defining the relationship and the actions that they took on both sides.
So talking about sharing information, that was the essence of your work at Connecting Food, I think, which was all about making information available to share across the supply chain. When you were the chief sales officer, I assume that you didn't go there explicitly to set up partnerships, but you understood when you went that was going to be an important part of how you might reach the market. How was management as you introduced that idea to them? Were they open to it, or did it take a lot of convincing?
The same. They were a bit reticent, but I mean, rightly so, because we were a scale up at the time. And as a scale up, you have limited resources. And so you can't necessarily, you don't want to get sidetracked. And it's very easy when you work for a startup or a scale up to get sidetracked with opportunities as they come. So I did understand their hesitation with wanting to spend a lot of time investing in someone without really necessarily knowing what they could bring us in return. And so we kind of took the same stance where I found one company who was working with a lot of our target list, I would say, of potential customers. And so we were doing blockchain for food traceability and transparency. And a lot of that happened through a QR code. And I realized that a lot of our customers were using the same printing company within their factories. And so I thought, okay, we'll have to partner with them because they'll be the ones printing the QR codes. And they have access then to the entire value chain, and people, they're a global company. So we started having discussions with them.
So you were a software company, they were a hardware company.
Yep. And so looking at how we could potentially integrate together. And so we started with this test customer, and that eventually grew, where we started being able to approach more and more customers together. And for me, the big advantage on their side was that since they were selling big printing and packaging equipment into these big factories,
right.
Those aren't the types of things that you're selling every year, right? They're 10, 20, 30-year, sometimes 40-year projects that they have going on.
Mm-hmm.
And as time goes on, it's harder and harder for them to have reasons to get in or to get a meeting with the product owner, the product manager, any of the staff. And so by partnering with us, it was a way for them to have an in, to come in and say, hey, we saw this interesting technology. We thought of you guys. And it's a way for them to position themselves as the bringer of innovation and as sort of a trusted advisor versus coming in and trying to upsell them on something or the new widget or whatever. So it was really kind of a win-win on their side because it opened doors for us and it allowed them to position themselves as a very forward-thinking, innovative company who was concerned about bringing value to their partners or to their clients.
I love that. I've talked to so many companies about that, and so few. I mean, they kind of acknowledge it intellectually, but they can't embrace it emotionally. Did you find that they were able to point to revenue over time that they had won because they got in to talk about and create deals, never going in to introduce their equipment, but rather going in as part of the partnership? And lo and behold, then they discovered some pain and helped them create a deal. Could they point to deals they'd won that fit that narrative?
Yep, for sure. They were able to suggest in some instances where we knew for sure that the customer wanted to move forward to either upgrades. I think they were actually able to do full line upgrades in a few of the customers when we had initially started working in. It also kicked off some software development ideas for them on their side, be it for their printing software, upgrades that could be done, that then they were able to turn into upgrades that they could sell to their customers as well. Wow. So like you said, there's the theory and there's the practice, but for me, it also opened up the conversations with them for their customers to help them identify some of these pain points that then they could go out and look for solutions for internally as well.
And that's such an important piece of trying to get partnerships going, because there's the product value proposition that's rather cold. I mean, lots of products can offer a similar value proposition if you're talking to sales channel or talking to potential partners, but the business value proposition, if you find companies that really are creative and thoughtful and open, that can be so meaningful. Of course, that also becomes part of the way that you can identify your ideal partner profile. Are they willing to think creatively about things?
Yeah, for sure. I always think finding in partnerships, I mean, it's like dating, right? And now there's going to be more misses than there are going to be hits. You know, you're not going to get married to every single person you meet. Same for partnerships. It really is, again, about having conversations and finding the ones where you are in alignment on your vision, your shared objectives, and your values. And it takes time and it takes a lot of conversation, open discussion, but there are always people out there who you can find to at least try and collaborate with. Yeah.
Do you have a checklist or key questions that you've learned are appropriate to ask as part of that vetting process?
That's a good question. I don't have a formal checklist that I use. Could be interesting to to think about writing one day. Because for me, it tends to be a series of conversations that evolve over time. I mean, really, it is like a marriage where you start to broach a topic. Are you interested? Is this person interested in me? And then little by little, you start asking those hard questions, and you try to see if there's overlap in the market share, if there's overlap in the customer base, if there's overlap in how you might envision working together. And I look at it more as a series of conversations, but I'm sure there are templates out there. It'd be interesting. And
do you have a formal written ideal partner profile, or is that kind of an output of these conversations as well?
We do now in my current role at EIT Food, but back in the early days, it wasn't something that we had. It was more us thinking about what are we hoping to achieve internally with the partnership, and then trying to identify companies who maybe could help us go that route. Another aspect I think that's interesting is to talk to your current customers as well and find out who they're working with. That was always something I did was, okay, who are your suppliers? Who are your equipment providers in this sense? Are you happy with how you collaborate with them, and try to get their feedback? And then from there, I would take away and go and do my homework and see, okay, do I see a potential way for us to collaborate with them? And then if so, ask my client for kind of a warm intro or referral to start having that conversation. Because then if it's coming from their customer as well, they're a lot more open to getting into that discussion versus just a cold call.
Right. Yep. But it's no different than just regular sales. I mean, it's a warm introduction.
Yep.
Culturally, have you found, is there anything different between Europe and the US that makes companies more or less open to partnership, or is it really just a function of every company has its own culture and see how it works?
Yeah, it's a interesting question because I do a lot. My previous role before I just moved to this position, I was working in startup corporate collaboration where you see a lot of similar crossover, and we even within Europe, the cultures can be so different. I'm based in France. We have a lot of colleagues in Spain. We have colleagues in Germany. We have colleagues in the Nordics, in the UK, and even within those countries, we see so many of these cultural challenges. And I had a call yesterday with one of our corporate partners and a startup who are exploring a collaboration together and how they might partner. And it was a British startup and French, half Dutch company. And so afterwards the startup called me and was like, that was a very abrupt call. They were so direct. And and I was explaining again the cultural differences. The Dutch are very upfront and very direct, and the French can be quite to the point and upfront as well when they when they feel like it. So for the British culture, which is a lot more I don't know, what would you say? It's a lot not conservative. What's the word I'm looking for?
I understand what you mean.
Yeah, they're very respectful and don't want to make any waves.
Right.
So it's a bit of a confrontation of cultures. So for sure, that's just within Europe. And then when you start looking at going back and forth between the US, it can be equally challenging, I think. So something definitely to keep in mind when you're thinking about partnerships.
So speaking of Europe and France, did you stick around for the Olympics?
I did. I was debating about it because they made such a big to-do everywhere about how terrible it was going to be. There were going to be so many people. It was wonderful. It was quiet. It was so
nice.
Quiet here. Yeah, it was great. Everyone was in a good mood. The public transport worked perfectly. People were smiling. The streets were empty. It was
so no month-long holiday for you.
No month on holiday. Everyone else went on holiday. It seems like everyone else left Paris that I do, but I was here and I enjoyed the peace and quiet, and also gave me some time to really start thinking about my new role and strategy as well, and how I want to be able to build partnerships in this position. So nice. I actually enjoyed the calm. Yep.
So speaking of European holidays, I know from experience of working with you just bits on a couple different things over the years, you certainly don't work any 35-hour week. You put in long days. How do you juggle work-life balance when, again, there's these different cultural views? There's kind of the manic U.S. work culture and then a more relaxed European approach.
Yeah, I always say that I strive to be more like the French, because I think the French, they say the French work to live and the Americans live to work. So that was one of the things I found really interesting when I moved to France, is that people don't identify themselves by their job. One of the first questions you ask an American is, what do you do? Where right. It is in France, you can be at a party or dinner, have a conversation with someone, and work will never come up. And then you could realize later you're talking to the CEO of a company, or you were talking to a garbage man.
Right.
And it just doesn't really play into how people engage with one another here. Work is just how they make enough money to be able to live and go on vacation and enjoy their time with their families. So I think that's really, really noble and very balanced. And they do say, I think the World Health Organization lists France as the most productive country in the world, surprisingly enough. So even though everyone goes on holiday for the entire month of August, they make up for it for the rest of the time. For me, I appreciate today, having worked a lot for scale-ups in the past where it is very high stress, high expectation environment. I appreciate working now for an organization that does encourage work-life balance. So it's a bit easier for me now that I'm out of the tech environment, and it's a bit more forced
right.
forced on me. But when you like what you do as well, it's also hard to stop.
But how do you take advantage of that time with more balance now? What do you do?
We have a really interesting, well, it's interesting to us, a side project that might not be relevant for your audience, but we actually started an association to encourage local production of food
really?
On the rooftops of nursing homes and social housing in Paris. So there's all these rooftops, really it was born through COVID, where we're looking out our windows and seeing all these empty rooftops. And also the knowledge that I was gaining at EIT Food about urban greening, all of these heat islands in cities, difficulty of certain populations to access healthy foods. And so we have been farming a little bit in our time on this plot of land. And so we decided maybe that all this unused space could be actually used to build gardens. And so we have a pilot site right now on a nursing home in our neighborhood that's been up and running since October of last year. So coming up on a year soon. And the idea is just to see how can we get the residents involved? What's the impact on their health? What's the impact on local biodiversity as well? And then trying to really understand what types of food will grow well on a rooftop, because a rooftop environment with full sun exposure,
Sure.
wind exposure, it's not the same as growing in the ground as well. So that's been taking up a lot of time, and for sure something I wouldn't have had time to do working in startups.
Well, obviously, that passion for food is not only what you do for work, but it's what you do for relaxation and entertainment too.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
And I would not have picked up from your accent Minneapolis until you started talking about the roof. When you talk about the rooftop, well, I've heard that before.
Rooftop, I can say, yeah. Or bag, I hear bag and bagel give me away too.
Right. All right, let's dive down more into the weeds on executing partnerships. I got a bunch of questions. We'll just kind of run through them quickly. We've touched on this a little bit, but if you could give us 3 or 4 bullet points of what makes effective partnerships, what would you say?
I think for me, it's really about setting expectations. I think it's good to do a test case, like I mentioned, to really determine what both sides can get out of it, and is there a match, and really try to determine as well what's the joint mutual benefit for the customer as well. But then it makes sense to really sit down and try to do some kind of formalized, whether it's a workshop, some kind of meeting to really determine what the partnership framework is going to be. So what's going to be the scope? Are we limiting it to a certain product line? Are we limiting it to a region? Certain new markets? What's the duration? What does engagement look like on both sides? What are both sides committing to? Things like, do we need to create training programs? One of the incidents that I have in mind that really where it didn't work out, it's related back to training, where the other side's training wasn't enough, where they actually felt comfortable going out to speak about what we were doing. And that really caused the whole partnership as a whole to fail, because we didn't understand that they needed actual more formal training, and they didn't communicate that back to us. So really, yeah, so that's one topic. And I think one thing that maybe doesn't get brought up enough is how public do you want the partnership to be as well? Do you want it to be communicated? Because for us as a young company, it was really valuable for us to say that we had partnered with this,
Sure.
big global organization. Sometimes they didn't always want that to be made public until they were sure that the partnership is going to be a success. So there's a lot of things around communication, both internal communication, external communication, that you really have to work out. And that's not even counting, are there any financial incentives? Is there any revenue sharing? Is there any of that bits? But there's a lot that goes into the work, I think, actually, before you get into the weeds of deciding on any of the revenue sides of things.
And do you find the pilot project is the forum in which you flesh out those expectations, or do you have to have all that done before you embark on the pilot?
For me, the pilot project serves as kind of the test case to really flesh it out, because otherwise it's a lot of theory of what you think might be the benefit. And some of the benefits you might not have anticipated that might come from customer feedback, for example. So for me, I like to use the pilot test site as the way to really determine out, and then go to management with then a better fleshed out list of what we think will be the value proposition for the company, and then of course for the partner as well.
And so when you go to management to get the buy-in, number one, have you determined, is there any role that tends to be more skeptical? For instance, is the CFO normally against it, whereas the VP of marketing may be in favor? That's number one. And number two, do you just make the business case that I believe is going to help us grow revenue this way, or do you try to pitch it in any different sort of a way?
In my experience, it's often been the CEOs who have been most hesitant, and I think at some point it comes back to this not made here kind of theory, or if it wasn't their idea, they tend to be the ones with the most pushback and that need the most convincing. So I think that internal sale can be really challenging, and it really is about how you position it. But at the end of the day, money talks. And so if you can really show that this can open up a new market, it can allow us to explore a new market without hiring, without increasing our workforce. It can give us access to new technologies as well, or even insights that can help us with future business decisions. All of that eventually, once you make a good enough case, it's hard for them to at least say no, and to at least give it a trial period. You can always say, we're not signing on forever. We can sign on for a year and then reevaluate and see how it goes from there.
Right. You shared that great example of connecting food and the printing company. Do you have other specific examples that you can share of successes?
We also tried to look at partnering with several different software companies as well. So we tried looking at partnering with SAP because we noticed that a lot of our manufacturing customers were using SAP within their factories. And that was a really successful case. It took a long time to be listed on their store because there's a lot of requirements. So it really required a lot of software development on our side to be able to be eligible for their partner store.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, that ended up being a really great move for us. One, because of the visibility that it gave us, and two, because then it opened us up to all of their account managers as well. And we could be doing outreach to their account managers and then going to say, okay, can you introduce us to General Mills, or can you introduce us to Danone, or can you introduce us to all of these big major accounts? And we could go in together. And having that integration with SAP was a really big proof point for us. We then tried to replicate that with Microsoft as well, because Microsoft has their own software, their own cloud servers, all that, and their own partner program. And that was a big failure, actually. That was a case where their partner program wasn't really set up to incentivize their sales force and their account managers to partner with companies who were listed in their store. They hadn't quite figured out at that time anyways the right way to encourage their own sales force to really engage. And so for us, again, we spent a lot of time investing in that. And in the end, it really was a flop for us.
And how do you know when it's time to pull the plug?
That's the big question. I think it's anything, whether you launch a new product and you just keep waiting it out, you hope. But I think at some point when the resources that you've put into it haven't amounted 6 months, 12 months, max, then it's time to say, okay, this is maybe a mistake and we need to go back and reevaluate or look at another direction. I know we've also had a few instances where we tried to partner with other smaller companies. And that was also a challenge as well, because on both sides, as to, let's say, startups, neither side has the resources needed.
Right.
And so that made it really, really difficult. We did try to build several partnerships with others who, on paper, it would have made sense for us to collaborate, but just for lack of common resources, it didn't really ever amount to much.
When it's time to pull the plug, do you find some people hesitant because of sunk costs? They say, well, maybe if we just hang in there a little bit longer, maybe it will work? Or are people ready, in general, in your experience, to say, you know what, this was a mistake, let's just walk away?
I think in the startup world, they walk away easier. Things are so agile, they move so quickly that, you have to make snap decisions.
Right.
And in the startup space, I think when you're working with bigger organizations, it is harder to think, okay, we've invested all this time, all this resources, we should try and hang it out. So it does take longer for them to actually admit that the partnership isn't working out.
Got it. You talked about, with SAP, co-selling, identifying target accounts that you could work together, collaborating. I assume very detailed collaboration between salespeople. That's different than what a lot of companies think of partnerships as being this passive sort of a thing that somehow yields rewards just by virtue of announcing this collaboration. How did you reach that point where you were doing co-selling, and how was that coordinated?
It took a concerted effort, I think, on our side. We were really trying to make ourselves visible. We were seeking out any opportunity where we could to leverage the fact that we were starting to work with SAP. So they had these wonderful SAP stores, these SAP stores around the globe, and they're great showcases of different technologies, different partners that SAP has come to work with. And so we really, really pushed to get our technology, our blockchain technology, visible in their SAP stores, because they bring all their global accounts to these stores. And we also worked to find out how our technology could be implemented with other partners within the store. So it made it a nice story. So we kind of built the story for them and brought it to them as kind of a storyboard. And then that allowed us to get a position in their store for several years. We were actually in there, and that was a wonderful showcase for us. We also work with them to partner at different events. So if there were different events coming up, we could come together and say, could we perhaps be in your booth, be there to talk to your customers, support your own salespeople. If the conversations come up, we can be there as support and try to position it a bit that way. And it also gave us a chance to be at these trade shows and spend long periods of time with the account managers and with the sales and the marketers as well, to start building our own relationships with them. And then we offered to do webinars to with them. So we really were just trying to look at any kind of angle we could use to, one, reinforce our relationship with them and leverage the visibility. Yeah, so really going at it at a different angle. And I think, especially when it comes to new technologies or more complicated technologies, the more comfortable people feel talking about it, the more likely they are to talk about it.
But the whole point is it's people doing business with people. And what you're describing is a very sophisticated, very broad look at how to build relationships and build connections and access their audience and access their customer base. And none of it sounds like, was left to chance. You set out quite deliberately to identify these opportunities, to cultivate them, to make it easy for SAP to work with you, to make it easy for their people to work with you, for them to get to know you, to build those relationships. And I think that strikes me as a really important takeaway from this conversation, because I think too many people may be intrigued by the idea of partnerships, but again, think it's something they can somehow just manage passively. And
I was going to say, it's a lot of passive, passive action.
And it doesn't work. I mean, nothing works if you do it passively. You have to actively engage in anything that you want to be successful.
Yeah, for sure. And it did take, but on the other hand, I mean, it was a bit of a gamble because it took time, right? It did take a lot of time to do this. And luckily it worked out. But with Microsoft, it didn't work out.
And that makes it tricky, because if you put the same effort into direct sales, you're going to have a much faster flash to bang time figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And you're going to generate some revenue. You're going to generate at least some projects in the pipeline. With partnerships, you'll have a lot of anecdotal success, but nothing you can point to in terms of revenue. And so it takes a patient management team, I think.
Yeah, and maybe, side-by-side approaches as well. So you're still continuing on with your sales cycle, but then again, resources, it does have to be a balance of resources to do so.
Sure. So you talked about what makes successes. I assume that in many cases, it's the inverse of those that lead to failures. You talked about where expectations weren't properly set. You talked about 2 startups, neither of which has adequate resources to put toward it. What other conditions do you see can lead to disappointments?
I think the 2 main issues that we struggled with were around IP. So if there was any kind of common new IP that was generated from a project, that could sometimes lead to roadblocks where one side wasn't willing to give up or share or license IP. So depending on who you're partnering with, if there is new intellectual property being generated, that was a blocker for sometimes. And other times was the topic of exclusivity. People wanting either exclusive access to what we're doing, exclusive access to a particular region, to a particular product line. And depending on the size of your company, depending on your own growth strategy, that could also be a blocking point. So for us, those tended to be tricky topics to deal with. And if they went too far down one road, that often was a blocking point to the partnership continuing on.
Is there ever an appropriate time to say yes to exclusivity? That feels like a very slippery slope.
There's a way to do it. We saw it a lot with it's a blockchain company, because it was a new technology and because people wanted to position themselves as very innovative. They would often ask, I want exclusivity for all pork products in the world. And so we would try to look at exclusivity based either on a time frame, knowing how long it takes to the project to get to market. So we would try to build in either a time frame or build in a region where we perhaps didn't have other active partnerships or other active customer bases, or limit it to a specific segment as well. So there are ways to get around it. Of course, if you have no exclusivity, that's the ideal stage, but there are ways to build it in time frames or segments where it can happen and you can still make it work. So it's not definitely a blocker, but it does make it more challenging because of course everyone starts from global exclusivity.
Sure. Right.
And then you have to work back to find something that works on both sides.
Right. So we had a personal experience collaborating at one point, kind of a baby step in a potential partnership. We had met. I had 2 clients that were machinery manufacturers at different points in the food production cycle. And so collaboratively, we put together a webinar with your company and those 2 companies, all with clients who are interested in food tracking. And I thought it was a good, substantive session with some good information. But then afterwards, there was just crickets from those 2 companies. And obviously they didn't see the value or they didn't have resources to put toward it. That certainly wasn't a pilot project, But what percentage of your experimentation would you say actually yields some success, and what percentage ends up like that and just kind of an interesting discussion but nothing more?
That's a good question. And I think thinking back to that case, I wondered if perhaps the distance wasn't one thing, with us being located in France for one
I will
thing.
say both those companies' parents, though, were in Germany. So they were in the
Yeah, that's
U.S.,
true.
but their parent companies were European.
And perhaps us not working hard enough to help them make the sale internally about why it was worth at least trying or exploring. I think looking back, that could have been something we could have helped support it. But again, for me being on the startup side, resources were also very, very tight as well. Because like I said, I think the interest was there potentially from customers, but also the misunderstanding of the technology, or the limited understanding of what blockchain was and what it would entail to implement, I think was maybe a bit of a barrier and a bit too forward thinking for the time. It'd be interesting to see now, several years later, that people's understanding has evolved, what that would be like. But I think I'm coming around. What was your question I was supposed to be addressing again?
Really, what percentage do you see? You have lots of conversation. How many? Is it 5% or 50% that actually get some traction?
I was going to say 10% off of my gut feeling. It's, yeah. I mean, I think it is a relatively low percentage, which is why kind of the test and explore side of things is a good way before you get too far down the path and you invest too much time into these relationships. Yeah.
So obviously it's a long-term play. We've talked about how it's slow to build. We've talked about how you don't really have revenue, at least as a short-term sort of a metric. Certainly that's the long-term objective. But how do you measure success? What KPIs do you find, are helpful during the first 6 months, first year, first 3 years as you build that revenue ramp?
And I think looking back, I mean, a lot of, especially within the manufacturing industry, it is a lot of long sales cycles.
Right.
Anyways. So I know for us, we were looking at oftentimes 9 to 12 month sales cycles minimum, sometimes longer. And so that does give time then to build partnerships and also rely on your partner's insights, because they also have conversations, they have histories with these customers. And so you can really try to understand them. That can help and sometimes accelerate slightly, but it does mean you're spending a lot of time together. For me, it's a lot of hypotheses that you're setting up when you start to say, okay, how do we measure success? So whether is it reaching a certain number of clients together? Is it a certain number of engagements? Is it we try to enter a new market, or you try to help us enter a new market? And how many accounts do we actually end up converting? Is it certain revenue? I mean, for me, it's so varied. It depends on the product. It depends on the segment that you're working in and the industry that you're working in as well. I think communication is one thing that people often forget, but I think communication should also be measured, because that's the primary tool or the primary key for success. And I think that communication needs to be very intentional, and there needs to be a very clear owner on each side of the partnership. And those two or teams need to commit to meeting together for regular meetings and progress updates, because as soon as that starts falling to the wayside, I mean, you know how it is. Everyone's got full-time jobs. We all have a million things to do. And if you don't intentionally make that time for that communication and for those updates and for the problem solving, then that's when the partnership really starts to slide, I think.
Does that sit in sales or in general management?
I think more on the sales side. I mean, it depends on who the owner is, but I think the owner tends to sit in the sales team typically. But the owner needs to be empowered to be able to take that time as well from management to have those conversations and to keep the partnership alive and active.
And how long do you think the runway needs to be? Obviously, it's going to vary, and the sales cycle is a factor. But if it's in that 9 to 12 month sort of a sales cycle range, how long does a company need to roll with it, assuming that there's positive vibes around communication and that they're getting into accounts and they're having conversations? How long a runway? Do they need to plan 2 years to make an informed judgment, or can they go shorter than that?
I think 2 years is a good time frame to start out with. I think that's a good enough time to start tackling kind of your first conversations together, is trying to start build kind of your joint pipeline and then see what converts within the following year. So I think 2 years is a good plan.
And with your experience, you've been in machinery manufacturing, you've been in tech, and you've built partnerships between tech and machinery manufacturing. Is there a difference that's important to understand in how those two types of companies look at partnerships? I think they're much more common in the tech space. I mean, like you said, SAP has their online stores where it introduces people to complementary technologies. That's not the case in machinery. So how do you bridge that?
Yeah, I think the tech side is much more used to partnerships and licensing other technology and building APIs that they're compatible with other software. So for them, it's almost a given that they're going to do that, and it's part of their mindset from the beginning. Whereas maybe more on the manufacturing and machinery side, they don't necessarily have that history or that past.
Aside from sales channel.
Yeah, essentially, they tend to be a bit more conservative in thinking of outside of the box, the non-transactional sides, I should say, of partnerships. So that takes a lot more time, I think, to cultivate and to share the mindset that comes with it, I think. So
and you mentioned earlier, I'm sorry,
make a bigger hurdle. So
you mentioned earlier in your current work at EIT that the partnerships are really complex. You get PPPs that you're building. So I assume you have to be as much a diplomat as a partner manager. What have you learned about, from that complexity, what lessons have you learned about being more successful in managing partnerships?
What's really interesting now, and I'm still learning as we go, because now we're trying to look at building partnerships often in a pre-competitive space. And so trying to look at investing in co-investing or co-financing the development of new technologies, which can benefit the industry as a whole. And that can be really challenging because if there are new technologies or high potential technologies coming out, of course, people want to own a piece of it. And so that's been a really interesting thing to navigate and to try to negotiate with partners and try to find out where is there space for us to collaborate together that benefits us all collectively and not individually, I would say. So that's something I'm still learning how to do and growing in that aspect. And it's definitely been a really interesting challenge to take on.
Yeah, I would think it must be. Let's talk about that kind of stereotypical mid-sized industrial manufacturer, maybe a company that makes machines used by food manufacturers. I'm going to run down a list of potential places for partnerships. I love the example of how you looked at their environment and you found the printers. So you're probably going to have some others, and you'll have some commentary on each of these. But I'm thinking ingredients, maybe industry working groups, and from areas beyond there. So in other words, not just machine groups, but food safety groups, grocery retailing groups, food science groups, maybe trade associations, maybe regulators or regulatory consultants, labs and universities, research organizations, lobbying groups. I'm sure there's some I'm missing, and there's some that I've mentioned that you think are fruitful or frustrating. So give me some more on where a company ought to go look.
That's a good question. I think outside of maybe asking your customers who they would recommend that you connect with, because then they might see already possibilities for collaboration. I really like different trade shows and conferences because that's an environment where then you have opportunities now, especially with these B2B platforms, networking platforms. You can really try to connect with a very broad range of organizations with a limited time investment. They do these kind of speed dating things, so you can really kind of see, at least with our 15 minutes together, does it make sense for us to continue the conversation or not? And then and you can either check that off your list or plan a follow-up. So I tend to do a lot of those types of organizations. I think LinkedIn can actually be a really interesting place to connect with people, based on postings that you see. If you see something that's interesting, if you see someone is posting about doing something interesting, just try to connect with them and see if they're interested in having an informal chat. But of course, trade associations, any kind of body that's bringing people together that share a common interest, it's a really ripe opportunity, I think, to have those conversations with people.
And when you were at EIT and you uncovered that opportunity with the barcode printers, did you have a formal framework for doing your investigation to identify those opportunities, or was it just going back to these organic, natural, curious conversations that you're having?
It just started out of curiosity because we were really, wanting to understand the limitations of putting a QR code on a package. So we are also exploring working with packaging companies as well, and really trying to understand, what are the limits? How big can your equipment print a QR code? Is there a certain resolution that we need to have? Does it need to be a certain color? Really, that's how the conversation started.
I see.
And then from there, it was them asking questions, trying to understand a bit more about blockchain, and us trying to understand about where they're working, what their space was. And it really just evolved out of curiosity on their side and on our side as well.
Understand. So to that industrial manufacturer, that middle market machinery building company, let's say $100 million, typically they've got a sales team, maybe 15 people. They've got a marketing team probably of 2 people. So it's not a software company. It's not a tech company. They're not putting 50% of revenue into revenue growth functions. They're putting a much smaller percentage. Who do you recommend owns the partnerships in that case? Do they need to hire somebody specifically for it? And if they're going to hire somebody, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, thinking of the way you described the way you evolved into it because of your natural interest and curiosity. Not many people are going to be like that, and so they're going to have to try to hire somebody with a skill set and stipulate the activities rather than have somebody with a great deal of initiative demonstrate them. So long-winded, complex question there, but how would they staff it and how would they find the right person?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question for those mid-sized companies, because creating a specific role for partnerships when you don't have the proof that it works yet, it can be hard to justify, and I can see it can be hard to get budget for
Sure.
that. I would like to suggest that maybe it start with somebody within the sales team initially, at least for the test case, or a combination of sales and marketing, because marketing does play a big role, I think, in the communication that comes with partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have someone with a propensity within the sales team who'd be willing to try and test it out and at least show that the value is there, and then at that point, like you said, bringing somebody in who has someone who has more experience and who can then set up a structure and a process, and then look at growing that, because then they have a use case they can work with to then go out and search for other partners.
And so when
there's not the big expenditure of hiring someone, but yeah.
Sure. So when you identify that person on the sales team and ask them to start working on it, do you recommend carving out part of their time? How do you make sure that there's adequate attention that gets put toward it so it's a legitimate experiment?
For sure. I think in that sense, it makes sense to have it be part of their objectives, trying to build it into their objectives for the year, and then making sure that they have the space to actually give them the opportunity to build those connections, to make those connections, to help them find the right opportunities then to explore, and for sure making sure that they've got that built into their own work schedule. Because of course, if you're just asking someone to take it on, but you don't give them the bandwidth to do anything with it, then it's not likely to go anywhere. So,
but it means also you have to adjust their quota and you have to make other accommodations for the way they're going to be spending their time.
And for sure, knowing that in the short term, there might not be any concrete outputs.
Sure.
That it is a long-term investment.
Yeah, in fact, you say might not be. I would say you have to assume that there will not be over the course of the short term. Again, particularly if there's that 9 to 12 month sales cycle.
For sure.
One of the major values, I believe, is reaching each other's audiences. And that could be done by going to trade shows together, by being in a store in the case of a software company, by offering webinars to each other's audiences like we did with those couple companies that I brought to you. Do you have any other tips on how to really proactively and appropriately cultivate each other's audiences?
I think, again, going back to LinkedIn, it depends on the company. I know a lot of essentially manufacturing companies might not necessarily be very, very active on LinkedIn. Some are, some aren't, but cross-posting together, I think, can be really powerful. I think articles, you can do different newspaper articles. It's quite easy nowadays to get announcements put out, to get online media at least to pick up. Newsletters, I think, are a good opportunity to share information on both sides as well.
Right.
Anything that you can do to get more eyes on both sides, I think, is open
Sure.
for discussion.
And what do you recommend that you consider great resources for learning about both theory and implementation of partnerships? You've taught yourself, but you must know of books and podcasts and blogs or YouTube channels that you turn to now for continuing education and finer points.
That's a good question. I don't know if I've ever read an actual. I tend to read a lot of business books, sales books, but I don't know if I've actually ever Brad, you're giving me a trick question here a little bit.
Well, then you need to start writing a blog
then
about
I need to, or start doing some more research, and maybe in my current role, it could actually be really, really helpful to get some other insights that I might not have had yet. I'm afraid I can't really give any partnership specific recommendations. I think there's a lot of good ones, maybe more around the sales side, or just about not being likable, being approachable, being curious.
Mm-hmm.
I think, because for me, that's how the most interesting conversation started, is when you ask questions. And I know for my particular sales teams, I always said you guys should be talking 30% max of the time and listening 70%, because that's where opportunities then open up. So
what books do you recommend to help with that?
One of the really old ones I think that is still relevant is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Right.
I think there's a lot of really good insights, even though I think that book was written in almost nearly 100 years ago, I think. Right. Now. It's a very easy read and very interesting. And there's also the Dale Carnegie Institute as well, and they have some nice training programs that I've sent different people on my team to at different parts on presentation skills, on developing relationships. So there's always, I think, continuing education opportunities. I'm trying to think of some of the other. I should have looked at my book list.
Do you read in English or French?
I typically read in English.
Do you?
I typically read a little bit every day. What's the name of the book that I'm reading right now? If I could pull it up quick. I'm reading a book called Obviously Awesome right now. How to Nail Product Positioning so customers get it, buy it, and love it. So
there was a good product positioning or brand positioning podcast with Shane Parrish on the Knowledge Project with April Dunford recently.
Okay, I'll have to check that out too.
So you've dropped a lot of really important information. I think you've introduced yourself to listeners as somebody who's really thoughtful and knowledgeable about this. How do folks reach you if they want to connect?
I think LinkedIn is the best way. Please feel free to reach out and add me on LinkedIn. Send me a message. Happy to have a chat. If you have any good books, I'm open to any recommendations for good books and partnerships too. Since that's apparently a hole in my library I need to fill.
Yeah, there's actually Franz Schrepp, who I mentioned earlier, a German guy who now lives on the West Coast and is a kind of fairly well-known partnership expert. He just released his book on partnerships.
Okay, great.
So that's one possibility. And there was a French company called Reveal that had an interesting kind of software. It was really applicable for SaaS companies, but what it would do is look at both of your databases kind of confidentially, not intermingling the information, but identify the places where you had customer and prospect overlap to foment those conversations that you talked about, sales team to sales team, and how to get into it. They were actually purchased by a U.S. company, and I can't think of the name. But that tied in with the Nearbound initiative, which is also a good, interesting source of partnership information, and a guy named Jared Fuller, who is now on to something else. But he had worked partnerships at Drift, and then he did Nearbound, and then Reveal bought Nearbound, and then when Reveal got bought, he left. But in there's I think a variety of other sources, but largely toward the tech space. So you have to be willing to think creatively if you're in industrials about how you can interpolate some of those activities and best practices into your world.
Oh, wonderful.
So this has been a great conversation. I know it's getting kind of into the evening for you. So let's wrap this up. You understand the industry that many listeners are in, having been in the capital equipment space, having collaborated with capital equipment companies. So wrap us up with your perspective on what you've learned in the last years since you've been working in partnerships, and clarify why you think companies ought to take it seriously and how they should start.
That's a big question.
It is.
I'll just sum up. I don't think partnerships are going away. Partnerships aren't going away. The most successful companies out there are the ones who are putting in the time and the effort to build partnerships, and it really does allow you to expand your resources to not necessarily double your sales force, but to open doors that you might not have had access to, or at least not immediately or in the near future. So I think it is worth taking the time and investment to explore. And maybe partnerships aren't for everyone. I mean, I think there should also be the caveat that perhaps it doesn't fit the company culture, but it is worth, I think, taking the time and effort to look into, because we can see how it can help either enter new markets, access new technologies, reinforce relationships with your own customers, increase sales, increase revenue. I mean, all kinds of the benefits definitely outweigh the efforts that you put in when you find the right person to partner with.
And you've talked about starting with pilot projects. You've talked about asking your current customers who maybe you should be talking to. Any other tips on getting started?
I think just be okay to think outside of the box. I mean, definitely at Connecting Food, we never would have thought of working with a printing company.
Right.
We wouldn't have thought of trying to partner with packaging manufacturers. I mean, we just, it's not something we would have initially considered in our wheelhouse, but the opportunity came up, the spark was there, and then we started exploring it, and it eventually led to some really great successes. So I think it's okay to just allow yourself to think outside of the box.
And somebody has
to be inspired from other industries as well.
And somebody in the company has to own it and have that passion and have that openness. And congratulations on you having done that now a couple times. I mean, it's a neat story to listen to you tell.
It's really interesting because until you and I started reconnecting again, it wasn't something that I'd been really necessarily conscious of, actually. But then when you start to put it all together, yeah, I mean, it can happen really, really organically, just out of showing interest and having conversations with interesting people. So.
Right. Well, that's a perfect way to wrap it up. Just conversations with interesting people. That's exactly what this has been. So thank you so much for your time and for your insight, Samantha.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Good. So for everyone listening, you know what's coming next. I got to ask you to drop a comment below this episode. You know, agree with something Samantha said, disagree with it. Let's have a conversation. Like the episode, share it, and please subscribe. So thank you for joining Samantha Gadenne and I for this episode of the Industrial Growth Institute Podcast.